Thomas Callahan was never the kind of man to believe in fate. But the moment he met Elena on a crisp October evening at a mutual friend's engagement party, he felt something inexplicable shift inside him. She was radiant, a mix of confidence and grace, her laughter carrying above the hum of polite conversation like a melody he couldn't forget. Their courtship was whirlwind by most standards. Within a year, they were married in a small, picturesque ceremony under the sprawling oak trees of Elena's childhood home in North Carolina. The venue had been her dream, and Thomas, ever the planner, ensured every detail was perfect. Her flowing lace gown, the string quartet, even the custom vows they exchanged, it all painted the picture of a couple destined for forever. For the first few years, they were inseparable. Their evenings were filled with shared bottles of wine and long conversations about everything and nothing. Thomas admired Elena's drive. She had transitioned seamlessly from college to a successful career in event planning. He was a financial analyst, methodical and detail-oriented, the perfect counterbalance to her creative energy. But like so many modern couples, life grew busier, and cracks began to form. Thomas often worked late, poring over spreadsheets long after Elena had gone to bed. She, in turn, took on more high-profile clients, often jetting off to weekend events. Their time together dwindled, but neither addressed it. They thought their love was strong enough to survive on autopilot. Then came the topic of children. Thomas had always envisioned himself as a father. Elena, however, was hesitant. Maybe in a few years, she'd say, her tone non-committal. He didn't press her, at first. But as their 5th wedding anniversary approached, he broached the subject again, this time more firmly. "I don't want to wait forever," he admitted one night as they sat on their porch, the warm summer air thick with the scent of jasmine. Elena had been quiet, staring at the stars, before finally nodding. "You're right. Let's start trying." Their journey to parenthood wasn't immediate. Months turned into a year, and the constant cycle of hope and disappointment began to take its toll. They consulted doctors, underwent tests, and made lifestyle changes. Thomas gave up his late-night coffee habit, Elena switched to yoga and a stricter diet. When the pregnancy test finally showed 2 pink lines, Thomas could hardly believe it. He remembered Elena standing in the bathroom doorway, the test trembling in her hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "We're going to be parents," she whispered, her voice catching. He'd swept her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. For a while, it felt like the missing piece of their marriage had finally fallen into place. As the months passed, Thomas threw himself into preparation. He read books on fatherhood, baby-proofed their home, and built the crib himself. He was meticulous, determined to be the best father possible. Elena, meanwhile, glowed with the easy grace of an expectant mother, her belly growing rounder with each passing week. But not everything felt right. It started with small things. Elena's phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now always in her pocket or face down on the table. She laughed a little too much at her text messages, and her explanations about late-night calls with clients felt vague. Thomas tried to dismiss his suspicions as paranoia. Pregnancy hormones made emotions run high, he told himself. But deep down, a seed of doubt had taken root. One night, as Elena sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, Thomas casually asked, "Who's keeping you so entertained?" She glanced up, startled. "Just work stuff," she replied with a quick smile, before turning the screen away. "Must be a funny client," he said lightly, masking the tightness in his chest. "Just stressful," she said, her tone dismissive. "I'm juggling 3 weddings this month." He let it go, but the unease lingered. It wasn't just the phone. There were the nights she came home later than expected, claiming her prenatal yoga class had run over, or the way she seemed distracted during their conversations. Thomas found himself second-guessing everything. Was he imagining things? Or was there something Elena wasn't telling him? When her water broke 2 weeks before her due date, all of Thomas's doubts were momentarily swept aside. The next 36 hours were a blur of hospital corridors, monitors, and muffled voices. He stayed by Elena's side through every contraction, holding her hand and whispering reassurances as she screamed through the pain. And then, finally, Abigail arrived. The first time Thomas held her, the world seemed to stop. She was so small, so perfect, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb as if she already trusted him completely. He kissed her forehead, vowing silently to protect her, no matter what. But as he glanced at Elena, exhausted but beaming from her hospital bed, the doubts crept back in. He hated himself for thinking it, for even letting the idea form in his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The way she had laughed with the young male nurse during their hospital stay, the vague way she described her prenatal classes, every moment fed into the nagging voice in his head. When it came time to leave the hospital, Thomas was eager to get home, to settle into their new routine as a family. Yet as they stepped outside, the brisk air waking him from his daze, he noticed Elena's smile falter. "What's wrong?" he asked, touching her arm gently. "Nothing," she said too quickly, shifting Abigail in her arms. The morning was chaos as Thomas tried to juggle fatherhood and work obligations, both pressing on him like weights he wasn't ready to bear. Abigail's soft cries echoed in the hospital room as Elena packed their belongings with the slow, deliberate movements of someone running on fumes. "I'm sorry I can't take you home," Thomas said, pacing near the window while checking his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. Elena, cradling Abigail against her chest, offered him a faint smile. "It's okay, Thomas. You've done enough. Go to your meeting. The taxi will take us home just fine." "I know, but," he hesitated, feeling the guilt clawing at his chest. "I should be there for you. I should drive you both home." "Thomas." Her voice was calm but firm, the way it always was when she needed to ground him. "You have to work. We'll be fine." The arrival of the taxi cut off any further protests. A sharp honk from the parking lot announced its presence, and Thomas rushed to gather the last of their bags. "I'll bring these down," he said, gesturing toward the door. Elena followed him out slowly, Abigail still snug in her arms. The bright winter sunlight was almost blinding as they stepped outside. The yellow cab idled near the curb, its engine rumbling softly. The driver stepped out, a wiry man in his late 40s with a Mets cap perched on his head and a grin that struck Thomas as too practiced. "Morning." "Congratulations," the driver said, tipping his hat toward Elena as he grabbed the hospital bag from Thomas. "New parents, huh?" "That's right," Thomas replied curtly, his eyes narrowing as he handed over the rest of the luggage. The driver's gaze lingered on Elena for a second too long, his grin widening in a way that made Thomas's stomach churn. "You're lucky, pal," the driver said, nodding toward Elena as she climbed into the back seat. "Beautiful wife, beautiful baby. You hit the jackpot." Thomas stiffened, his jaw tightening. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. The driver turned his attention to Elena, his tone shifting to something softer. "Let me know if you need anything, ma'am. I'll take good care of you and the little one." Thomas froze. It wasn't what the man said, but the way he said it, a casual familiarity that felt entirely out of place. "Thanks," Elena replied, settling into the seat. She glanced at Thomas, offering him another reassuring smile. "Go, Thomas. You'll be late." He hesitated, his eyes darting between Elena and the driver. Something about the way the man kept looking at her made his skin crawl. "You sure you'll be okay?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "We'll be fine," Elena said. The driver chuckled, tipping his hat again. "Don't worry, buddy. I've got this." As the taxi pulled away, Thomas stood frozen on the curb, his unease growing with every passing second. He glanced at his car, his pulse quickening. "Maybe I should have driven them," he muttered under his breath. He climbed into his car, the seatbelt digging into his chest as he gripped the steering wheel. He told himself to shake it off, to focus on the meeting. But the image of the driver's lingering smile and the tone of his voice replayed in his mind like a broken record. Finally, unable to suppress the gnawing doubt, Thomas made a decision. He pulled out of the hospital parking lot, his heart racing as he tried to remember the taxi's route. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're being paranoid." But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, his foot pressed harder on the gas. He scanned every street and intersection, searching for the familiar yellow cab. After several tense minutes, he spotted it. The cab was a few cars ahead, its license plate partially obscured by grime. Thomas hung back, keeping a safe distance as it meandered through the city streets. The first 10 minutes felt normal enough. The taxi stopped at red lights, merged into traffic, and took what appeared to be the fastest route out of downtown. Thomas's heart began to settle, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. But then the cab turned onto a side street lined with tall hedges and older houses, veering away from the expected route to their suburban neighborhood. "Where are you going?" Thomas murmured, his chest tightening again. The cab continued down the quiet street, the houses growing sparser and the trees casting long shadows across the road. Thomas's unease deepened. He followed at a distance, his eyes locked on the taillights of the taxi. Minutes turned into half an hour as the cab wove through increasingly secluded neighborhoods. The streets were unfamiliar now, the kind of place where houses sat far apart, hidden behind gates and overgrown hedges. Finally, the taxi pulled into a gravel driveway, partially obscured by tall shrubs. Thomas parked discreetly at the corner, shutting off his engine and leaning forward in his seat. His breath hitched as he watched Elena step out of the cab, Abigail cradled in her arms. She seemed calm, almost too calm, as she handed Abigail to the driver. "What the hell is going on?" Thomas whispered, his pulse pounding in his ears. The driver secured Abigail's car seat in the front passenger seat, then turned back to Elena. They exchanged a few words, their voices too low for Thomas to hear. And then Elena nodded. Thomas's chest tightened as he watched her climb into the back seat of the cab, the door closing softly behind her. The driver followed, his hand brushing her arm as he slid into the seat beside her. The shadows of their bodies blurred together behind the fogging glass. At first, Thomas tried to convince himself it was nothing. Maybe Elena needed to feed Abigail or adjust something in the car. But the longer he watched, the clearer the truth became. The driver leaned toward her, his arm moving around her shoulders. Elena didn't resist. Through the fogged window, Thomas saw their lips meet, the kiss unmistakably passionate. Their movements grew more frantic, their hands roaming as if nothing else in the world mattered. Abigail sat alone in the front seat, oblivious. Thomas's body trembled as rage and heartbreak surged through him. The life he thought he knew was gone, and all he could do was watch as it unraveled before his eyes. Thomas sat in his car, staring at the fogged windows of the taxi parked just 20 feet ahead. His breathing was shallow, his chest tight with anticipation and dread. The gravel driveway was eerily quiet, the surrounding houses too far apart for anyone to notice what was happening. The scene played out like a slow-motion nightmare. His wife, Elena, had stepped into the back seat of the cab, followed by the driver, an exchange so casual it might have seemed innocent to an outsider. But to Thomas, every detail carried the weight of something much darker. He thought back to the morning. Elena had insisted on calling the taxi herself, brushing off his offer to arrange the ride. She'd said it was easier that way, but now that small detail twisted in his mind. Why didn't she want me to handle it? His stomach churned as he stared at the silhouettes shifting behind the fogged windows. At first, it was hard to tell what was happening. The faint outline of the driver's head leaned closer to Elena's. She didn't pull away. Thomas's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He told himself to move, to get out of the car, to confront them. But something kept him rooted in place. He needed confirmation, a reason to believe that the sickening knot in his stomach wasn't just paranoia. The minutes stretched on, each one an eternity. The shadows in the cab moved again, more deliberate now. Elena's profile tilted toward the driver's, her hand rising to touch his shoulder. "No," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, jolting him from his thoughts. He snatched it up without looking, his thumb hovering over the screen. It was his boss, no doubt wondering why he wasn't at the quarterly review meeting. "Not now," he muttered, silencing the call. But the phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with the same name, Jeremy Simons, boss. Thomas swore under his breath and answered, his voice tense. "Yes, Jeremy. Where the hell are you?" Jeremy's tone was sharp, the irritation palpable even through the phone. "The CEO is here, the board's waiting, and your chair is empty. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" Thomas hesitated, his eyes locked on the cab. The shadows moved again, closer, their movements almost synchronized. He could see Elena's arm now, wrapping around the driver's neck. "I had a personal emergency," Thomas said quickly, his throat dry. "Well, handle it fast," Jeremy snapped. "If you're not here in 10 minutes, don't bother coming back at all. This is your career on the line, Thomas." The call ended abruptly, leaving Thomas staring at the blank screen. He let out a shaky breath, the weight of his boss's words pressing down on him. But no amount of professional pressure could pull him away from what was unfolding in front of him. The shadows in the cab grew more defined. Elena's silhouette leaned closer to the driver, their faces barely inches apart now. The glass was fogging more, obscuring the finer details, but the intimacy of their movements was unmistakable. Thomas felt his chest tighten, a mix of rage and despair twisting inside him. He thought of Abigail, sitting alone in the front seat, oblivious to the betrayal happening just behind her. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the driver's arm moved down, his hand tracing the curve of Elena's body. She didn't resist. Instead, she leaned into him, her head tilting back slightly. Thomas's mind screamed at him to act, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, forced to watch as his marriage unraveled in front of him. The cab rocked slightly, the movement subtle but enough to make Thomas's breath hitch. He couldn't see every detail, but the implication was clear. They were lost in each other, oblivious to the world outside. The phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another call from Jeremy. Thomas ignored it, his focus unbroken. Every moment felt like a dagger to his chest. The truth was undeniable now, Elena and the taxi driver weren't strangers. The way they moved, the ease with which they touched each other, it all pointed to a relationship that had been building long before this moment. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of infidelity. The driver wasn't some random man, he was someone Elena had chosen. Someone she'd coordinated with, trusted enough to bring into her life. Thomas's mind raced through the past few months, searching for the signs he had missed. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the sudden changes in her behavior. It all added up now, each detail falling into place like pieces of a sinister puzzle. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to process the betrayal. He thought of the life they had built together, the promises they had made on their wedding day, the joy they'd shared when they found out about Abigail. All of it felt like a cruel joke now. And still, he couldn't move. The cab shifted again, the fog on the windows thickening. Thomas clenched the steering wheel, his mind torn between fury and heartbreak. He wanted to storm over, to rip the door open and confront them, but a voice in the back of his mind held him back. What would he say? What could he say? He couldn't stay here forever. Thomas's hands trembled as he reached for the door handle, his breath shallow as he prepared himself for what came next. Thomas's breathing was erratic as he stared at the cab. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out the faint rustling of trees in the stillness around him. Abigail's tiny figure sat in the front seat, her little head tilted as though she was trying to make sense of the world. The fogged windows of the taxi mocked him, their cloudy veneer hiding the intimacy inside. Thomas could still see the shadows, moving, merging, sealing the betrayal he had tried so desperately to deny. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the plastic creaking under the strain. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to act, but he felt paralyzed, trapped in a whirlwind of emotions that refused to settle. Then Abigail's cry pierced the silence, a sharp wail that shattered his hesitation. "That's it," Thomas muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with fury. "No more." His hand reached for the door handle, his movements mechanical as he climbed out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, the sound loud and ominous in the otherwise still air. He approached the taxi slowly, his heart pounding harder with every step. He could feel the anger rising, coiling tighter and tighter inside him, but beneath it was something else, something darker. A sense of finality. When he reached the back door, he stopped, his hand hovering over the handle. For a brief moment, he hesitated, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. But then he yanked the door open. The scene inside was worse than he had imagined. Elena was leaning into the driver, her face flushed, her hair disheveled. Her hands gripped the man's shoulders, pulling him closer as their lips met again and again. The driver's hands roamed freely, his grin smug and self-assured even as the door swung open. The look on Elena's face when she turned to see Thomas standing there was one he would never forget. "Thomas," she began, her voice faltering, her expression shifting from shock to guilt. But Thomas didn't let her finish. His hand shot out, grabbing the driver by the collar and yanking him out of the car with a force that sent the man stumbling onto the gravel. "You piece of," Thomas growled, his voice low and venomous as he swung his fist. The driver barely had time to react before Thomas's knuckles connected with his jaw. The impact sent the man sprawling, his Mets cap flying off as he hit the ground. "Thomas, stop." Elena's voice rang out from inside the cab, but he ignored her. The driver tried to scramble to his feet, his hands raised in a weak attempt to defend himself, but Thomas was relentless. He grabbed the man by the shirt, lifting him slightly before landing another punch, this one to the side of his head. "You think you can touch my wife?" Thomas roared, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. "Hey, man, I didn't," the driver started, but Thomas silenced him with a knee to the stomach. The man groaned, doubling over, and Thomas finally stepped back, his chest heaving. He stared down at the driver, who lay sprawled on the gravel, coughing and clutching his ribs. "Don't you dare come near my family again," Thomas spat, his voice trembling with rage. He turned back to the taxi, his gaze locking with Elena's. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "Get out," he said coldly, his tone devoid of the love and warmth it once held. She hesitated, her mouth opening as though to protest, but Thomas wasn't in the mood to argue. He reached into the front seat, carefully unbuckling Abigail's car seat and lifting her out. The baby was crying, her tiny fists flailing as Thomas cradled her against his chest. Her cries were sharp and piercing, a heartbreaking sound that only added to the weight in his chest. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Elena frozen in the back seat of the cab. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he carried Abigail to his car. He placed her car seat in the back, his hands trembling as he secured the straps. Her wails didn't subside, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He felt too numb, too raw. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they turned white. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with yet another missed call from his boss. Thomas stared at it for a moment, his jaw tightening. He was already late. With a sharp inhale, he started the car and peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind him. He didn't care about the speed limit as he tore down the empty streets, the engine roaring as he pushed the car faster and faster. Abigail's cries filled the car, a constant reminder of the chaos he had just left behind. Thomas's eyes darted between the road and the rearview mirror, his mind racing. "How did it come to this?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the baby's cries. He thought of his boss's words, the ultimatum hanging over his head like a guillotine. If he didn't make it to the meeting, his career, everything he had worked for, would be over. But as he sped through red lights and weaved between cars, his mind kept drifting back to Elena. The image of her with the driver was seared into his memory, a wound that refused to heal. He clenched his teeth, the pain morphing into a cold determination. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know how to fix the shattered pieces of his life. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. Thomas pulled into the office parking lot with Abigail's soft cries still echoing in his ears. He had driven like a man possessed, weaving through traffic and running red lights, the sound of her wails cutting through his fury and heartbreak. When he parked, his hands were trembling. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 25 minutes late. He unbuckled Abigail from her car seat, her tiny body tense with the leftover hiccups of crying. He tried to shush her, but the sound of his voice was too raw, too shaky to offer any real comfort. Carrying her into the office daycare, he avoided the concerned gaze of the receptionist. "She's just tired," he muttered as he handed Abigail over. The receptionist hesitated, clearly wanting to ask more, but Thomas turned on his heel and walked out before she could say anything. By the time he stepped into the meeting room, the atmosphere was already charged with tension. The long conference table was surrounded by executives, their sharp suits and sharper expressions making Thomas feel even more out of place. At the head of the table, Jeremy Simons, his boss, fixed him with a piercing glare. "You're late," Jeremy said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that promised a storm. "I know," Thomas replied, trying to steady himself. "I apologize." There's no excuse for it, but I had a personal emergency. The room was silent. The weight of all those eyes on him made the air feel heavier. Jeremy leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. A personal emergency? Thomas hesitated, his chest tightening as the words he hadn't planned to say tumbled out. My wife, his voice faltered for a moment. I just found out she's been unfaithful. I had to pick up my daughter and deal with the situation. The room shifted uncomfortably. A murmur passed between some of the executives. Thomas avoided their gazes, focusing on the polished surface of the table as if it could anchor him. Jeremy sighed, his expression softening slightly. Thomas, you should have called. We could have rescheduled. I didn't know what to say, Thomas admitted. I didn't want to let the team down. Jeremy stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. Let's talk outside, he said, gesturing for Thomas to follow. The hallway felt quieter than it should have. Jeremy's sharp footsteps echoed as he stopped and turned, his expression a mix of irritation and something almost like pity. Thomas, you're one of the best people on this team, but you're a wreck right now. I can see it all over your face. And I'm not going to pretend like this meeting matters more than what you're dealing with. Thomas blinked, caught off guard by the shift in tone. Take a break, Jeremy said firmly. Paid leave. 3 months. Handle your personal life. Get your head on straight. Come back when you're ready. Thomas swallowed hard, the words landing like a lifeline. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Jeremy placed a hand on his shoulder. Hang in there. And don't wait too long to figure out what comes next. When Thomas returned home that afternoon, the silence inside the house felt oppressive. Abigail had fallen asleep in her car seat during the drive back, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that should have been soothing. Elena was in the living room, pacing near the window, her face pale and tense. She froze when she saw him walk in, her eyes darting to the baby in his arms. Thomas, she said quickly, her voice trembling. I'm so sorry. I can explain. He didn't respond, his expression unreadable as he set Abigail down in her bassinet. It wasn't what you think, Elena continued, her hands wringing together. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. Thomas's voice was low and cold when he finally spoke. You called the taxi yourself. You didn't want me to do it. Why? Elena flinched as if the question had physically struck her. I didn't think it mattered. It mattered, he said sharply, his eyes narrowing. Because you knew. You planned it. No. It wasn't like that, she protested, tears welling in her eyes. I wasn't thinking straight. It just happened. Please, Thomas, you have to believe me. He stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. When he spoke again, his tone was flat, almost emotionless. You put our child in the front seat of that car. While you were in the back, with him. Did you think about what you were risking? About what could have happened to her? Elena opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her tears spilled over, but Thomas didn't feel any sympathy. I want you out of this house, he said finally. She froze, her face crumpling. Thomas, please. Don't do this. We can work through it. No, he interrupted, his voice firm. We can't. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. And I won't let you stay here and pretend that everything can go back to normal. Her tears turned to sobs, her shoulders shaking as she stood there, rooted in place. Where am I supposed to go? She asked weakly. That's not my problem, he said. Pack your things. Leave. Elena hesitated for a moment, but the finality in his tone made it clear there was no point in arguing. She gathered her belongings in silence, her movements slow and deliberate. When she finally stepped outside, she turned back to look at him one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The door closed behind her, the sound echoing in the empty house. Thomas leaned against the wall, his body heavy with exhaustion. He glanced at the bassinet, where Abigail stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny face scrunching up before relaxing again. The next morning, he was at a lawyer's office before the clock struck 9. I want to file for divorce, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. The lawyer nodded, pulling out a notepad. Let's get started. For the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas felt like he was regaining control. What would you do if faced with such betrayal? Could Thomas have handled it differently? Share your thoughts and reactions in the comments.